I realized that in this profound way, which is I was already a monster, right? I
Mm.
had already been told, right, that I was a monster. So I would be with my people. Hello and welcome to How to Be a Terrible Daughter. This is the podcast where we hate your parents for you because we know you're busy. We know you don't have time. And it's something that you push back because it's a way of taking care of yourself. And that's a
Yeah,
hard
it's a
thing
lot
to
of
do.
effort to have that much hate, and so we're happy to take some of that off your plate for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. We're professionals. We know exactly how to do it. So, yeah, we like it. We like hating your parents. So, we're going to make terrible jokes about how we survived our childhood, and we're going to give you some tips on how we did it. Yeah, have some community time.
If you're someone that's ever been called terrible or horrible or useless or worthless by your parents, welcome. You've found your people.
We've got cookies and blankets. Sorry, go
Cookies and
ahead.
blankets. Who are we? I am Megan. I am a occupational therapist and a medical intuitive and an energy healer.
I'm Elizabeth. I'm a psychotherapist and a multimedia artist.
And we are
And we're
cousins.
cousins.
We're cousins. So, if you've been listening to the podcast, we're going to do something a little different today that we're both super excited about. We were talking about doing it for a long, long time. Like, even before we actually even launched the podcast, we talked about doing something like this. So, we are going to talk about a movie today. And Elizabeth and I, we probably have mentioned this in the podcast, but we both grew up in LA. So, we both grew up like immersed in movies and immersed in the culture of movies and immersed in everything about movies. So we both love movies. We come from an old Hollywood family. And so, like, we grew up in the whole culture of movies. And I mean, basically, like, part of our family got established in the US because of movies, right? So,
Yeah. And
yeah.
it's an
So
industry town. It's an
it's an
industry
industry
town.
town. Yeah.
You can't avoid
So
it.
we've talked for a long time about doing sort of a movie episode and tying it into what we do. And then a couple weeks ago, I put a post up on my Instagram for my business. And I think I said something like how to know you're a childhood trauma survivor or abuse survivor. And one of the things I put down was you watched The Lost Boys obsessively when you were growing up and you found all of the vampire characters incredibly attractive. And somebody commented on it. I think it might have been Lauren, shout out to Lauren, saying like, "Oh, is that what that was?" or something like that, like guilty or called out or something like that. And we'll talk a little bit in general about why it's vampire movies as a whole that sort of do this for people that have grown up with childhood trauma. But you and I grew up, we're Gen X, so we grew up with The Lost Boys as our vampire movie, right? Like our
Yeah.
Twilight.
Our
And
Twilight. A little grittier. A little
a little
grittier.
grittier. And so that's the one we're talking about. But, insert your favorite vampire movie here. Like it really, what we're going to talk about, a lot of the themes could apply to any vampire movie and why vampires are just so damn appealing to children of narcissists.
And if you ever want us to do a different vampire movie, you can always let us know. You can email us or whatever. So,
Yeah,
okay. So we're doing The Lost Boys. The Lost Boys was released in 1987. The director was Joel Schumacher. The writers were Jan Fisher, James Jeremias, and Jeffrey Boehm. It stars Jason Patric, Corey Haim, Diane Wiest, and Kiefer Sutherland. And this is the movie tagline, which I just love. Sleep all day, party all night, never grow old, never die. It's fun to be a vampire.
I do like that tagline,
Yeah.
which is also kind of ironic because, like, the vampires didn't do well in this movie. It's not like this is a movie where they ended up, you know,
Well,
like,
and that's one of those things about, the moralistic, gosh, it's like you have to have everything in society, fine at the end, right? So like one of my problems is that there's so many movies that I love like the first half of, or the first three quarters. And then I'm like, wait, hey, like all the people that I like are being punished. What's going on?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the joke about the Hollywood ending, right? Like, you take this, like, how many movies have we seen that are like from other countries and don't have a happy ending and things don't wrap up nicely, but then they redo it,
Oh, yeah.
for
Yes.
Hollywood, and like all of a sudden everyone's all happy at the end, and the bad guys get it and the good guys win, quote unquote. So
Right.
anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. What's the plot of this movie, Elizabeth? So for those people that weren't born between like very specific years that this movie came out when they were a teenager, you probably have never heard of this movie because I don't know that it's necessarily stood the test of time.
I don't
So
think it's in the canon. I don't
I
think
don't,
it's in.
I don't, we definitely are trying to bring it back for sure. We're doing all small part. So what the hell happens in this movie? I mean,
Okay.
what's it about?
I'm going to do a synopsis. So, after their parents' divorce, Michael, Jason Patrick, Sam, Corey Haim, and their mother, Lucy, Diane Wiest, moved to Santa Carla, California, to live with Lucy's eccentric father. Known as the murder capital of the world, Santa Carla features a bustling boardwalk where Michael is drawn to the mysterious Star, the girlfriend of gang leader David. Meanwhile, Sam befriends the quirky Frog Brothers, Edgar and Alan, who run a local comic shop and claim to be vampire hunters. They warn Sam about the town's dark secrets, but he brushes it off until Michael begins to exhibit strange symptoms after a night out with David's gang, including drinking what he believed was wine. As Michael struggles with his transformation into a vampire, he nearly attacks Sam, but stops himself. Sam, realizing the truth, seeks help from the Frog Brothers, who insist that Michael can only be saved by killing the head vampire. Suspicious of Lucy's charming new boss, Max, the group sets up an elaborate test during a dinner at the Emerson house, but Max passes unscathed. Meanwhile, Michael confronts Star, who confirms that David's blood turned him into a half vampire. Determined to break free, Michael devises a plan to rescue Star and a young half vampire named Laddie from David's gang. The group arms themselves with garlic, holy water, and wooden stakes to face David and his gang. During a chaotic battle at the Emerson house, they manage to kill several vampires using their homemade weapons. Michael ultimately impales David on antlers, but his humanity isn't restored, leaving the group puzzled. Just then, Lucy returns home with Max, who reveals he is the true head vampire. His plan was to turn Michael and Sam to lure Lucy into becoming the quote mother of his vampire family. As Max threatens Sam, Lucy's father crashes through the house in his truck, impaling Max with wooden stakes and saving the family. With the head vampire dead, Michael and the others are finally freed from their curse. In the aftermath, as the family catches their breath, Grandpa casually remarks, "There's only one thing about living in Santa Carla I never could stomach. All the damn vampires." That's what happens.
So spoiler alert, we've just spoiled the entire movie for you, but you probably could have figured it out on your own. So
Totally.
yeah, this movie came out. What year did it come out?
1987.
Okay, so 1987. Yes, I was prime movie going teen at that time. I think I probably saw this in the theaters two or three times. And it was one of those things where, like, I will say it was actually really similar to like my coming out process. It's like being queer, which is that I knew I was supposed to be attracted to the Jason Patrick character, who was like the very wholesome, protected his brother, whatever character. But no, I was incredibly attracted to Kiefer Sutherland and the vampire characters, the ones who
Yeah.
didn't give a shit about anyone, did whatever they wanted, abused people, turned them into vampires without their consent. Like, you know what I mean? We're just, had no allegiance. We're controlling and domineering. I mean, there's this scene where he's so controlling and horrible to Star. He's essentially like, get on my bike. And she's like, no. And he's like, get on my bike. Like, So, I felt conflicted inside because I knew that that was not
Yeah.
a good person. And yet, like that's who I felt the most attraction to in this movie were
Hmm.
the vampire characters. I think that there's something really key there about growing up in an emotionally abusive or an emotionally unavailable household that sort of makes these characters incredibly appealing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because, you were the golden child and I was the scapegoat. And I don't think I had any problem being attracted to the vampires. And I was thinking about this and I realized that in this profound way, which is I was already a monster, right? I
Mm.
had already been told, right, that I was a monster. So I would be with my people, right? I would be with my people, and they wanted me to, like if I put myself in the position of David, they actually wanted me to be a part of them. So it's like, oh, now I just wouldn't be lonely, right?
Oh, yeah.
And the sort of abusive stuff, I don't think really registered with me because I was so used to being verbally abused and gaslit and manipulated that now I watch the movie and I'm like, these are red flags and you should just walk the fuck away, Michael. This is dumb. But at the time, I would have been like, okay.
Oh, it didn't register to me at the time at all that that was at
Oh,
all abuse or red flags or anything. I just knew that I guess it was more like, oh, I shouldn't be attracted to the bad boy. Why am I attracted to the bad boy? At
yeah.
age whatever I was, 14 or 15 at the time, that's all that sort of registered. Now I understand why. But at the time, it was just like, I know that I'm not supposed to be attracted to the bad boy. And yet that was, I couldn't give a shit about Michael. Sorry, Jason
No.
Patrick.
Well, also, he was kind of dumb.
I am sure that he has developed as an actor and taken many classes and is I haven't seen him in anything recently, but I'm sure he's lovely now, but he was not a good actor in this movie. Like honestly, I was watching it and I was like the only people who can actually act in this movie are Diane Wiest and Kiefer Sutherland.
Corey Haim was okay.
He was okay. That's true. Corey Haim was okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I kind of want to dive in a little bit. If there are people that are in their place on their journey in recovering from their narcissistic family where they are still choosing partners are maybe a little bit callous or cruel or avoidant or manipulative or are gaslighting you. There's a whole scene in the beginning when Michael first goes into their lair where they're feeding him Chinese food and he's eating some rice and Kiefer Sutherland's like, "How do you like those worms, Michael? You're eating maggots." And he was like, "What are you talking about?" Then he looks down into the container and it is indeed maggots. And then he throws it to the side and it, falls to the ground and oh no, it's rice, right? So it was like, but that's such gaslighting, right? I was like, oh yeah, there's gaslighting, like making you doubt your own sanity, right? Like,
Right. Well, but then the great thing is they do it twice and then they give him the bottle and they actually tell him the truth that it's
mhm.
blood. And then he's like, okay, yeah, right.
Right.
So
Yeah,
it's
they
like,
do it again with noodles and tell him it's worms, right? And it does look
yeah,
like worms, right? Yeah. And so then when they finally give him the bottle of blood and it's in a wine bottle and they're like, "Oh, this is blood." He's like, "Yeah, sure, right." Yeah, it is just such I was like, "Oh my God, that is such classic gaslighting." You get so turned around that you can't trust your own instincts anymore, right? You can't
no,
trust your
no.
own judgment on things.
I also saw a really like this sort of micro gaslighting where Max was invited to dinner and Sam and the Frog Brothers have like done all of this stuff to try and prove that he's a vampire, which doesn't work. And he's leaving and he says to Diane Weist something like, kids need discipline, otherwise they're going to run all over you. Something like that.
Yeah.
It's great because she just looks at him and she's like, that's not what's happening, or that kind of a thing. But it was
Yeah.
like it wasn't what was happening. It wasn't at
Right.
all, you
Yeah.
know. Also, there's this narcissism of, sort of the end, which is it's like he made all these vampire kids, doesn't care about them at all. He just wants them to be controlled. And so he finds a person to be a parent to them, or that's what he wants. And
That's
it's
what he
like,
wants. Yeah. That whole thing, like, I wanted you
oh,
to be their mother was so creepy because, I mean,
what?
it was both, narcissistic just from like exactly what you said, but it also sort of shows the narcissism of like patriarchy in general, that women are just good for being like mothers and wives, like they're
Yeah.
objects, right? Like they're
Yeah.
interchangeable, right? I mean,
Yeah. And men don't
so
have any responsibility,
yeah. Oh my God,
right?
I saw the best social media post the other day that said, women who have chosen not to have children, would you have made the same decision if you had the traditional role of being a father?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Like if that was the
Wow.
level of responsibility that was expected of you, is sort of what it was implying, you know?
Oh my gosh. That's
Right? Because it's such a huge thing, like, oh, women, childless cat ladies, women choosing not to have children. And anyway, that's a whole other topic. So, yes, so the bad boys, I think that that's interesting what you said about you being the scapegoat, and it felt like, well, that would be your tribe, right? I
yeah.
feel like for me as the golden child, somehow it felt like those would be the people who would rescue me or take me away,
Yes.
you know?
Yes, me too. Yeah, they're scary enough and they don't give a shit enough that they can actually fight for you against the system, right? Or,
Mm,
all of those things that the narcissists use to clothe themselves in respectability and power, right? It's like we don't give a shit about any of that stuff. So,
that's true. It does feel like those, like they wouldn't be susceptible to the sway of the narcissist, right? Because, the danger is that you would bring someone home and
yeah.
they would, if they're a rational, normal human being, like they would be able to be manipulated. Where if you bring someone home who literally has no fucks to give, they're a vampire. They don't care. Like, who cares, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is sort of what happened with, like you said, with the head vampire. It's like, they just call them on their bullshit, right? Which was
Yeah.
sort of the fantasy growing up, is that someone would swoop in, whether it was a friend or
Yeah.
a teacher or a mentor or a significant other, and call our moms on their bullshit
Yeah.
in front of them and in front of everybody, right? Like that was sort of the dream. And I think that there's something that feels like these bad boy vampire characters would actually have the balls to do that,
Absolutely.
you know?
Yeah. Well, and they're showing that there's a whole way to live. There's a whole other world out there that has nothing to do with the narcissist.
Mm,
As I was rewatching, I was getting to the point where you go to the the vampire hotel, right? And I was like, "Oh, this is so great. Like it's so romantic." And then I realized like one of the things about it that was so appealing was actually how dirty it was. And as a grown-up woman, I'm like, "Oh," but I was like, my mom wouldn't even step foot in here. Like
yeah.
she was, she was Miss Hospital Corners. And so it was like, "Oh, someplace filthy." What bliss,
That's
So,
funny. Yeah.
yeah.
But I think it is interesting, so there's this immediate appeal, right? But then when you look at sort of, as we started to mention, like how Michael lures David in, it is absolutely how a narcissist lures you in, right? So there's
Yeah.
the gaslighting. There's a scene where they're like riding their motorcycles on this like bluff that, over, almost go out over the edge of the ocean, and they stop and Michael looks up at David and says something like, "What the hell are you doing?" And David says, "How far are you willing to go, Michael?" And so there's that boundary pushing, right? Like pushing you beyond what you're comfortable with. You know, it's this thing of like, oh, I'm going to be abandoned if I don't push my boundaries and like go a little further than I'm comfortable with, right? So you do things that you wouldn't normally do because you're worried about, being left out in the cold, right? Or being, punted out of the family in our case, right? So,
Yeah.
it's such a classic. The reason I love these vampire movies, and I think this was the first one that it sort of became clear to me because I was a fan, is like, oh, this is how you go from growing up in a family of narcissists to finding yourself another narcissist and
Yep.
dating, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because you would think that if you grew up with this shit, you'd be like seeing red flags everywhere, right? You'd be
Mm-mm.
like, whoa, that's, now I know to stay away from that because that was
Yeah.
miserable. But that's absolutely not what happens. In fact, you find your way to these people and you find them very, very attractive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for a
Yep.
number of reasons. There's definitely the patterns seem familiar. That's what what you think of as love. This is the only way you know how to gain a feeling of attachment and acceptance, right, is through these dances that you do. There's also just
Hmm.
the like neurochemical soup
Oh,
that your
yeah. The
has
trauma bond.
the trauma bonding and like, your body knows this level of cortisol and adrenaline and all of the other things as baseline, as normal. And so because we are creatures of homeostasis, you try to recreate that when you go out in the world. I mean, there's a whole lot of reasons. I think that it's really interesting that, there's a way that vampire movies in general, like vampires are sexy. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of, vampire lore where the vampires are sexy, right? And I
Hmm.
think that they're sexy in a way that superheroes are not, right?
Yeah.
Like, superheroes are good people
Yeah.
who are saving people and
Yeah.
doing good things in the world, and they're protectors, and they know right from wrong, right? And
You know,
yet they're not hot in the same way.
no, no. Well, I think also this is what comes to my mind, which is like superheroes aren't tearing shit down. They're keeping things up. And I think that there's this unexpressed rage that we carry. I think that part of us doesn't want everything to just, be destroyed. But it's like, what do we do with that? I also think that there is something about becoming such a powerful being, right? That the narcissist is nothing compared to you, right? They can't hurt you anymore.
And to go back to like how we start the show, like, welcome to the show where we hate your parents for you. Like, I feel like if I had become a vampire, I could have actually expressed my anger that it was not safe for me to express.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
and again, going back to like how to be a terrible daughter, this process of recovering from a narcissistic childhood is about becoming the monster,
Yeah.
because the monster is the one who says, screw you, I don't care, I'm furious at you for what you did to me, and
Yeah.
doesn't worry about the consequences,
Yeah.
which is kind of
Yeah.
what a vampire does, right?
Yeah. I think the tough thing is that, and this is what I see, which is that, you know, we're attracted to narcissists partly because that feels like freedom and health. Like for me, it was like, oh God, it's never about me and whatever. But this person's confident and they say exactly what they want, right? And people
Yeah.
seem to love them. And it's like, oh, well, that's what emotional health is like. And I can be like that in a relationship with them because that's how they act. But it's like, oh no, actually, that's not how. That's
It's
not how.
it's the mystique of the truth teller, right? People think that the truth tellers are the ones who are actually emotionally healthy, when that's
Yeah.
not necessarily the case, right? Like the person who, brands themselves as the truth teller, a lot of times is the person who is using cruelty as manipulation. And I think that when you come from a background like ours, it's hard to tell the difference at first.
So I'm going to ask you a question, which you don't have to answer, but you said that if you had become a vampire, a powerful being, you could express your rage. And so my question is, if you had become a vampire, would you have drained your mom?
Ooh. I think no, because I think what I would have done is worse, which is that I would have gone off and lived a life where I didn't give a shit about her and she didn't matter anymore, which
Yeah.
for her would have been worse.
Yeah.
I mean, in
Yeah.
fact, that is what I eventually ended up doing when I went no contact, right? Like,
Right.
and it
Yeah.
was really horrible. Like, she definitely lashed out in a lot of different ways, right? And sent flying monkeys after me and
Hmm.
whatever. So I think I would have done the same thing I did, but there's this fantasy that if you become a vampire, it happens in an instant. Because the reality is, when you're going no contact with a parent, it's an extended process that takes years or decades, right? And
Yeah.
there's not this moment where you're like, fuck you, I'm an evil being and I'm flying off now. I'm the terrible daughter. Peace out, right? Like, that
Yeah.
does not how it happens, right? Like, there's a lot of moral wrestling with, like, is
Yeah.
this the right decision? And, all of that, right? I mean, all of the things that people would say to me, like, but it's your mother and she raised you, and how could you turn your back on this person? And like, you just need to like work it out with her and have some conversations. Like, of course, I asked myself all those questions. Of
Yeah.
course, I would say all those things to myself as well, right?
Mhm. And you did all those things.
And I did all those things, right? So, I think that the fantasy of the vampire is just being able to like walk out the door and not have any conscience about it. I think that's the
Mm-hmm.
fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
I think the hard part about, disconnecting from the narcissist is working through, that's when it's your parent, especially, is
Mm-hmm.
working through all of the conflicting feelings. But if you're a
Yeah.
blood-sucking monster, you don't have conflicting feelings.
Yeah. Yeah, you're just in your own corner and you're willing, yeah, that you're willing to do whatever it takes to just have a good life and you don't have to, yeah, you don't have to worry about anybody. I think another thing that I find really profound is about vampires in general is that going back to attachment, right? Which is relationships are already dangerous. So to be in a relationship with a vampire, okay, I mean, it's just another type of danger. And I know that, we got really good at managing our parents, our moms. Who knows what they would have done if we didn't know how to manage them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And definitely like the fear of being hurt was part of my life and my relationship. And so when a sexy vampire boy comes around, it's like, so what's new here? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
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 So,
There's definitely the feeling of like, oh, I know how to do this, right? And even if it's something that's not the healthiest thing, there's an appeal to something being familiar.
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like there's an appeal to being like, oh, okay. In some ways, I can relax my nervous system because I know how this goes, even though it's a relationship that's going to be absolutely activating to my nervous system all the time, right?
Yeah. 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 There's also stuff about the romance of like, being wanted by an immortal being and it being forever. Because, one of my issues is is being wanted, right? Which is like this sort of roller coaster of idealization and then rejection
Yeah.
and shaming is like, it's off and on, right? It's like an
Yeah.
off and on relationship, but it's really painful. And so, this idea that this being first of all, has this tremendous desire for you, right? You
Yeah.
are wanted. Like that's incredibly attractive. And then this idea that like we'll be together forever. This being never wants to be apart from me,
Right.
ever,
It's like the
right?
ultimate love bombing.
And it is the ultimate love bombing.
You've said to me in the past, I don't know if you've said it on the podcast, but that being with a narcissist is very much like that thing of like you're only as good as your last film, right? Which is like
Yeah.
it's an old Hollywood saying where it's like, you can be an actor or director or whatever that's like on top of the world, super popular, but if you make a movie that's a dud, like you're never going to work again, right? So you have to consistently be bringing in the money, right? You have to consistently be producing stuff, that's good. And I think that it's true here. Like what you're saying is, you're going to be with someone that there isn't that roller coaster, right? They love you. There's this lore, right? Vampires of like they're going to love you forever. But I think that the thing that's funny is if you grow up in a family with narcissistic parents, the first time you actually find a romantic relationship with someone who's emotionally stable and healthy, and they don't give you the cold shoulder or the silent treatment or whatever when they're mad at you, it's incredibly uncomfortable.
Oh, yes, I know.
Like having that person who does actually stay
Yeah.
and does consistently love you through the ups and downs
Yep.
is at first almost more dysregulating than the roller coaster.
Yeah. Or boring. I remember the first couple
Or
of years of
yes,
my relationship with, Eric, husband of the pod. I would just be like, I don't know if I love this person. I just feel so calm, you know? I'm not afraid of being rejected by this person. It's not a roller coaster. And I don't know if that's love, And my therapist would just say over and over again to me, okay, do you want to break up with him right now? I'm like, no, no, I don't. Like, okay, that's all you need to know. And
Yeah.
then at some point, I got used to it, probably after a good amount of the EMDR work that we ended up doing. So, yeah,
Yes. That's the sort of like shitty legacy of growing up with a narcissist is it
yeah,
feels dreadfully uncomfortable to be with someone who's emotionally stable and healthy. And you
yeah,
have to actually work through the discomfort of that.
yeah,
Like you have to put in the work to get through the discomfort of that.
yeah.
And we shouldn't have to. Like that's brutally unfair that you should have to do a shit ton of inner work to be in a healthy relationship and have that feel good.
Yeah.
That sucks. That's another reason I hate everyone's parents who's listening to this because it's not fair.
Yeah.
It's not fair that you come out of this and then have to do work to actually find healthy relationships.
I said that in therapy. It's like, what? Why? I already had to go through it. Like now I have to do all of this other work. I find that, that what you're talking about happens to me in big and little ways. When someone gives me a compliment, I actually tense up. Like my toes curl and my hands, get like, a little claw-like, and like I can feel it. It's like I stop breathing and everything. And it's like I'm so armored. It's like I can't let any of that in. And it's terrible. But even with all the work that I've done, or like, Eric will say to me, I love you so much. And my immediate response is, why? Which is just, come on.
Mine, when
Really?
people do, I'm like, no, you don't.
Yeah, just
I
okay.
love you so much. No, you don't.
No,
What
no.
do you mean?
Now I worry about your choices and your opinion because I trusted you up until this point. But now if I make it onto your list, oh, okay. Well,
So I have this weird thing where it's very much like a come here, go away thing with compliments,
yep.
especially if they come to me not verbally, if they're written. I've noticed this. Let's say I get an email from a client and they're just saying like, how their symptoms have gone away and how amazing it is and how grateful they are for me or something like that, right? I simultaneously feel like they must be mistaken,
Right. Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so there's the like pushing away, right?
They're
And
implying causation, but it's
right,
really correlation.
right, exactly. Yes, yes, exactly. And I reread it 117 times to take it in, and it makes me just want to like, it makes me want to cry in a good way. Like it's a feeling of like being seen, but not being seen or perceived in the scary way. Like being seen or perceived was so scary growing up,
Yeah.
good or bad, right? So being seen or perceived as the bad child, being seen or perceived as the good child, like all terrifying, right?
Yeah.
This is a feeling of being seen and perceived as a worthy person, genuinely. And it still hits me.
Yeah.
It still hits me. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's really, really easy to continue to try to find people that do that for you, do the come here, go away for you. But even when you found people who don't do that, it's like you continue to do it to yourself.
I also, because when you talk about that, the word that comes up for me is that I'm ravenous for those things. And that
Mhm.
also reminds me of the vampire, right? This idea of this tremendous hunger and also the isolation. And I think the isolation that we are taught, the narcissist isolates us, and then we isolate ourselves and we're outside looking in. I feel like that's a part of the attraction too,
Yeah,
that we're seeing
agreed.
parts of ourselves. And I think one of the things about like vampire movies and other stuff like that is because we're gaslit so much, we don't get to see or think accurately about what we're experiencing. And so it takes things like mythology and, fantasy and sci-fi to tell an emotional truth that we're not actually allowed to be able to identify in
Yeah.
an intellectual way, right? It's like those things are broken up, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that is yes, absolutely in vampire movies, but I think that that's the power of art in general, right? Is to be a mirror for things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to see. And one of the things I love about fantasy and sci-fi is I feel like it's a mirror for society a lot of times. I mean, this movie was a
Absolutely.
mirror for us individually for sure, but like I also think that yeah, I mean it's a mirror for just sort of like speculative fiction especially. I feel like can be such a great mirror for society at large and our issues that it's sort of hard to see.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
I read an article that was really sort of was talking about the societal things that were going on. And so they were talking about how Reagan was president from 81 to 89. And I was born in 72. And I'd always asked myself, like, why do I feel much more like a child of the 70s than the 80s? And there's this tension in the movie between that sort of like the upright conservative, right? And like the traditional motherhood and, all that stuff,
Hmm.
and the dissolute, not materialistic, non-conforming teenager. In fact, like there literally was a lot of anxiety about teenagers and their rebelliousness at the time. And so just that conflict was,
Yeah.
really interesting.
Something I
So,
thought was interesting in the movie as well, and they just touched on it, but there's a line where when they first arrive in Santa Clara, Santa Carla, Santa Clara, it's Santa
Santa
Cruz. I don't even
Carla.
know, like
They had to change it. Well, one, they shot in Santa Cruz, but Santa Cruz didn't want
to be the murder
the
capital of the world.
yeah, they didn't want that. And then also there is Santa Clara, which is nearby, but Santa Clara also didn't want that. So they
Right,
so
so
they
it's Santa
created Santa
Carla.
Carla.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
All
yeah.
right. Anyway, when they first move in and Diane Wiest is talking to her dad, he says something about when most people divorce, they end up better off, meaning financially. And she says
Yes.
something about, like, yeah, but in this case, it was just better for me to get away from him and cut my losses. And like that really did make me wonder, like, what had these boys' fathers been like? Like, if this really is a tale
Yes.
of coming from a narcissistic childhood and then recreating that as you grow up, like, that's exactly what we have here. We get sort of this implication that the dad was someone that it was not worth fighting to get her fair
Yeah.
share of, of the
Yeah.
finances from, right? And so that
Yeah.
really made me wonder, like, what was this guy like? He must have been a monster, right?
Yeah.
For her to just pack up her kids and move with nothing.
She's thinking about her kids too because she's like it's not good for the boys. And it's like, "Oh,
Yeah.
okay." Yeah, she
Yeah.
she's the one who really cares. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And she's the one who sees through, like you said, sees through him at the end and says, that's not what's going on here, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. But she's also willing to sacrifice herself. Like when the head vampire at the end has her son in a neck hold, right? She's like willing to like offer up her blood to him to become a vampire. So it's like even people who are self-aware and know what are going on and have been able to extricate themselves from this situation in the past, like there's a certain point where you can't win with the narcissist. Like, do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like that to me felt like that moment.
Yeah, they will find your vulnerability and they will exploit it. They'll put you in a terrible position and then they will offer up a solution,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yeah, that
Yep.
benefits them and then they can say they rescued you, right?
Or that they
Yeah.
gave you the option.
Yeah. Yeah, you
I
chose
had the
this.
door open. She could leave.
Right. Yeah, but like I could have snapped your kid's neck in a second
Right.
and you know that.
But I wouldn't have really done that, right? Then they backpedal and claim that they weren't really going to do
Right.
the thing that they were clearly about to do.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Shout out for Chekhov's fence post. I have to say, like, there's, like the grandpa's like has all these like fence posts, these like giant stakes, in
Yes.
on his truck, and you see him trying to repair a fence, and it's like, okay, like this is gonna come back. So
Yeah. Well, he was repairing the fence with a sharpened fence post. Did you notice
I
that?
know, I know. I'm not quite sure if that's, but because I'm a city girl, I don't know those things. Also, this movie is super gay. It is super gay.
Yeah, really
The
gay. And
sexual
can we talk
tension between
about
Michael and David.
how homoerotic the way that men dressed in the 80s were with these little cut off, torn up shirts and the little
Hmm.
tiny pirate jackets and like like so insanely homoerotic, right?
Hmm.
Like the sort of Adam Ant aesthetic, like
Hmm.
pre-steampunk type of
Hmm.
thing. You know, the
Gender
long
bending.
hair, like so homoerotic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, the director was gay, and I don't know if he was in the closet, but I mean, being gay in the 80s and being a director, not easy. He is the guy who famously put nipples on the bat suit. So, the gay male gaze
Wait,
or the
which
female
Batman was
gaze.
that? Was that
Um,
Keaton?
no, no, Keaton was the first one, and that was Tim Burton. I
Who got the nipples? Was it Christian Bale?
No, 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 no. That's Batman Begins with Christopher Nolan. So I think it was like third or fourth, like Batman Forever, Batman and Robin. I think it was like the third and fourth,
I'm gonna
you
get
know.
so murdered by the Batman lovers who are just gonna be ashamed of me for not knowing my Batman. Sorry, everyone. I apologize for my
Well, there
lack of
is that
Batman
thing right
awareness.
there. Sorry, where is it Christian Bale? He says, I'm afraid of bats and I'm going to become the thing that I'm afraid of. That kind of applies here too, right?
Well, Batman's another like, I will say of all of the superheroes, like Batman is the like anti-hero, right? Well,
Yeah,
and
that's true.
his whole like raison d'etre is childhood trauma. He saw his parents murdered, right? So, like,
Yeah.
here we go, right? This is what happens. If you grow up with a nice, loving farm family, you become Superman.
Right.
If you see your parents murdered in front of you, you become Batman.
Yeah. And then it's Batman versus Superman. That's also homoerotic. We can't get away
Um,
from it.
yeah, it's interesting that there was one like female vampire character in this that was really like but there were no
Ugh.
romantic overtones at all between all of these boys and Star, right? Like,
Well, I actually have a theory about that. And it's also related to why there's the little boy, because she's a redeemable object. Let's put it this way. If you are a young woman and you're living in a cave with four hot guys, and I mean, come on, would nothing happen? You know what I mean? And it's like,
yeah,
and at that point, if she's had sex with four hot guys in the movie world, she's not redeemable.
yeah,
She's
that's
not
true.
a respectable object for Michael. So you have to have it be part of it is you have to have her be there for another reason, right? So she's the honeypot, right? It is homoerotic in that, they use her to find boys and she brings them in and then, yeah, that's kind of how it
Yeah.
goes.
Well, and also she was sort of the mother figure to Laddie, right? So
Hmm.
if you're not going to be a sexual object, you're going to be a mother object, right? So she had to be one or
Ugh,
the other,
right. Yeah.
right? So,
But who turned Laddie? I mean, that's the thing. It's like, who did that so I mean,
well, but that's always dangled in vampire movies as like the line where vampires
yeah,
become unethical is when they turn a child, right?
that's
Like,
true.
I
That's
can't remember
true.
which movie it is, you probably will, or which book it is, where there was like some tangential vampire character that was always sort of like, oh, he's not really part of our club. We don't talk to him. He's been exiled. And then eventually you found out it's because he turned a baby. Do you remember that? What
God,
is that from?
no, I don't know.
That's always the line that
Wow.
vampires are like, thou shalt not cross is, you don't turn
Yeah.
a little kid and you especially don't turn a baby, right? Because then they're a baby
A
forever,
baby.
right?
Yeah. That's really weird.
But it's weird. It is weird. It's this like vampire line of ethics, which
Right.
like why is there a line in the sand for vampires?
Okay, this is the movie I would want to see. I want to see the movie of Max meeting David and Max becoming enthralled with this boy, right? This teenage
Yeah.
boy. And who knows? It's very possible that David was not, you know, a hellion before he was turned into a vampire.
He was a
And
little tow-headed blonde kid.
Yeah, and
That's
who's
true.
just
I
acting
hadn't
out.
thought about the fact of this adult male turning these four clearly teenage boys into
Mm-hmm.
his quote unquote sons. Like,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
gay.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
I'd love to see that love story.
Yes, we need a prequel. We absolutely need a Lost Boys prequel.
Oh my gosh.
There
All
was
right.
a sequel, by the way. I haven't seen it. Have you seen it?
No, but there were two sequels.
There were
There
two?
was like The Thirst or some there were yeah, two. And they got Corey Feldman. They got Corey
Okay.
Feldman to come back. Yeah. By the way, the Frog Brothers, in retrospect, are chilling because when I saw them in the movie when I was a teenager, they were losers.
Yeah.
They were able to kill the vampires, but they were losers. But to me, it's like, did all of these people who are MAGAs now, is that like who they saw? Because it's just, all the camo and the truth and justice and American way and
Well,
toxic
and their parents
masculinity.
were incredibly unavailable. They had two hippie parents that were, every time they showed a shot of them, they were asleep. So they
Yes.
were running the comic book store on their own. They showed shots of
Yeah.
them like opening the store up and like
Yeah.
restocking it. So here were two kids that were parentified
Mm-hmm.
way too young,
Yeah.
right? Which is sort of, I mean, that is the legacy of these boomer parents who were like a
Yeah.
whole generation of parents of like younger Gen X and elder millennials, right? Who were
Yeah. Raised ourselves.
raised ourselves, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that like, I hate to say it, but like a good portion of the MAGAs, like we like to think of the boomers as these like creep, but it's actually Gen X. And I feel like Gen X sort of went down two paths, right? So there was the Gen X that
Mm-hmm.
did become like the vampires and the goths and the punks and the alternative kids, right? And ended up in therapy and ended up realizing like, oh, how I was raised is why I'm fucked up, right? Like, and then there was the Gen X that just like didn't do the inner work and ended up becoming the MAGA people, you know,
Okay.
which is terrifying.
Wow. Yeah.
But yeah, those two kids, I remember like they were the comic book nerds. It's not as nerdy to be a comic book person now, but back then that
Yeah.
was like super nerdy, like incredibly nerdy.
Yeah. They were low on the totem pole socially at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is interesting that they were the ones that could sort of see the truth.
Yeah. It's like this the conspiracy theory stuff that ends up being right, it's
Yeah.
tough. Yeah.
Well, and that gets into the whole thing of like, late stage capitalism and the gaslighting that's happening where you don't know what's true or not. And, we used to
Yeah.
always make fun of conspiracy theorists, but now it's like, you know, now you've got both sides being like, was the election stolen? Did they tamper with the voting machines? I mean, that's
Right.
happened in
Right.
subsequent election. Like, it's
Right.
really, really interesting to watch like, how the like playing out of late stage capitalism, which is like such a narcissistic system,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
is creating all of these like mass sort of belief systems or ways of thinking about the world that mirror what you and I already knew because we grew up with it,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's like,
you
well,
know?
which conspiracy? Which conspiracy do you believe? Right. And then, yeah, I mean, in some ways, we're like Cassandra. I mean, you just see it immediately. And then it's like, come on, people. Like, what's the, just, no. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's something I think that maybe we could talk on another episode, which is like how to survive in this world right now. Because if you're a child of a narcissist, you most likely have PTSD and your symptoms are probably going to get super kicked up in the next, if they haven't already.
I
So
have
maybe,
already
maybe we
started
can,
talking to my therapist about
yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So,
Okay, we should. I'm just looking at time. Do we
yeah,
want to do crazy mom off stories? Do we have movie related crazy mom off stories or vampire related
I
crazy
do.
mom off stories? Oh, awesome. I can't wait to hear
I
this.
do. I can't remember who. I was in a movie theater and I think I was talking to my mom about, we were going to see a movie and I think we were talking about Woody Allen. I can't remember if we were talking about Woody Allen or Roman Polanski. And I was like, I don't know if we should, see their movies, right? They're terrible, right? And she was saying no. Now that's its own thing. And I said to her, I was like, they had sex with like 13-year-old girls. Like, you know,
Yeah.
and she's like, well, that happens sometimes. Like, yeah, I mean, like, really? I, I mean, it's like you had a 13-year-old child at some point. You would have been okay with that, you know? Well, it happens. I mean,
My God.
it's
I
like, you know
think
what it is? It's like, I want to see this movie. I
yeah,
want to see this
I
movie,
want
and
to see
nothing's
this
going to get in the
movie,
way with
or
that.
yeah, so I'm just gonna justify anything as like that's just the way the world is, or
But I was like, this is the woman who is in charge of protecting me. I'm so lucky, right? So that's my movie related.
that's pretty good. I didn't prepare a story. I'm trying to think if I have a movie related one. I can't think of one. I'm trying to think if I have a movie related crazy mom story.
Can I tell a crazy mom story about your mom?
Yes, please.
So when my grandma Reba died, you came down for the funeral
Hmm.
and you came up to me at some point and was like, I need your help. My mom is following me and she's mad dogging me. And I looked over and she really was like, she was like a shark just staring at you. And it was very clear that like she was gaining on us. And so I took you and I think Eric, I don't know if Eric was already in a room. We'd already like hung out or whatever, went into this room and she actually was gaining on us. And Eric actually closed the door in her face. She actually got so close to the door that it was like she was going to come through. And it was so creepy. And you could tell that like she was there. She stayed there for a little bit.
At the
And it
door.
was, yeah.
Well, she
And
knocked for a while.
I don't
But even
remember
after she
that.
stopped knocking, you would say that day was so bizarre
Ugh.
because so it started at the cemetery.
Mhm.
Your grandma was buried in the mausoleum. So the mausoleum is sort of this like big T-shaped building with, ceilings that are crazy, crazy high. And I remember walking to where like we were all gathering in the mausoleum, and I looked down this incredibly long hallway that's like, just 6 stories tall of graves, essentially, right? Or I don't know what you
Yeah.
call them when they're in the mausoleum drawers. This a marble archway, huge marble archway. And at the very end of it was my mom wearing all black with a white collar on her dress or whatever it was and black sunglasses so you couldn't see
Jeez.
her eyes. But she wasn't moving. She was just staring at me.
Jesus.
But she was pretty far away, right? So at this point, she was like, I don't know, 50 feet away or something.
Hmm.
And I got so uncomfortable that I moved. Like I moved behind a
Yeah.
group of people so she couldn't see me anymore.
Jeez.
But then she subsequently kept getting closer and closer to me. It's like those videos that people do of their cats where they like, go behind a wall and then when they come back out, the cat is like a little bit closer, right? And then they go behind
Yes.
a wall and then the cat
Yes.
is frozen but a little bit closer. Like that
Yeah.
was actually what was happening with my mom. Like throughout that day, every time I looked, she was like a little closer to me. And
Oh,
I hadn't been talking to her. I'd been no contact for a while at this point. So she
right.
knew I didn't want to talk to her. She knew not to get close to me, right? But then, yeah, so finally, when we moved from the cemetery to your grandma's house, that's when she started getting closer and closer and closer. And yeah, then at some point, that's I think when I went up to you, I'm like, I need help. Like, I don't know. She's,
Yeah.
staring at me. She's getting closer. Like, this feels so uncomfortable. And that's when you took me into the bedroom with Eric. And yeah, but it was like a horror movie. Like she was just
Yeah.
staring at me, like from,
Yeah.
I'd be across a room and she'd be in the doorway, just staring at me, not talking to anyone, not. And I
Uh-huh.
actually
Yeah.
ended up having nightmares after that,
Yeah.
where there was a pool in the backyard of that house.
Yes. Yeah.
And at one point, I was on one side of the pool and she was clear on the other side of the pool, but she was just staring at me. So I was trying to be a
Jesus.
normal person, like having conversations with relatives I hadn't seen in a while or whatever, but I would look out of the corner of
Yeah.
my eye and she'd always be there, right?
Ugh.
Staring at me. So at one point, I remember she was across the pool staring at me, and this went on for a while. And eventually, I would leave. She'd be staring at me. I would leave. I would go
Mhm.
somewhere else, and then I'd find her again, right? Like in the corner of that room staring at me.
I'm so uncomfortable listening to this.
But I had recurring nightmares after that where
Yeah.
I was on the other side of the pool and she was staring at me and she like started running and she picked up speed and she ran clear across the pool, like superhuman, right? Like a
Yeah.
vampire.
Like a vampire. Yeah.
Like ran clear across the pool and, jumped on me and attacked me and started choking me or whatever. It was a nightmare, right? So,
Wow.
like, I had nightmares about that for years afterwards
Jeez.
that she ran across the pool and I was just like shaking and frozen because when you're like shot, like I couldn't believe she could run on water, right?
Yeah, you thought you were
And
safe.
so I was just sort of frozen in place and then she got me. But that whole day felt like she was trying to get me. Like it really
That
did feel like she was getting closer and closer and like she was trying to get me. It was quite terrifying.
she was, and the look on her face was, I mean, chilling. Like,
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
felt
it really
hunted.
was. I was scared. I was like, what the hell? It was not, it wasn't human. It
It
really
was
wasn't. It was cold, but it wasn't neutral. It wasn't quite malevolent, but it was like
it was dead
predatory.
eyes. It was like
Yeah, yeah,
dead behind her eyes.
yeah, it
Like creepy
was.
dead behind her
Yeah,
eyes. Yeah, that was a scary, scary afternoon. And I remember, why did I do this after all of that? But, trying to be a good person because I hadn't actually interacted with her the
yeah.
whole time. I'd been like, every time I would see her get closer, I'd like, move to a different room. But I remember at the very end of that afternoon, I was like, I'm going to be the good person. Like, I'm going to go up and say something. And so I went up to her and I just said, I was on my way out the door. And I just said, okay, I said, Mom, I just want to let you know that I hope you're doing okay. I just want to let you know that I hope everything's okay for you. And she was sitting on the couch and I was standing and she looks up at me and she goes, everything is not okay. And I think you know why. And I was like,
Okay,
okay, bye.
okay. And it just,
Gotta go now.
yeah, I, can't even. And in public, man. Yeah, it's just
Like, yeah, yeah. Anyway, so yeah, there's that story.
okay, great. Now I'm triggered.
That was one of the more creepy
Yeah.
interactions I had with her. Like, yeah, it was just like you said, there was something so chillingly cold about her that day. And I'm sure she was triggered because, like, several family members that weren't talking to her were there that day. So, that was probably extra triggering for her. But, she could have left.
Yeah.
As we said in our holiday episode that we just did, you can just leave.
Yes. Yes.
You
Yeah.
can just leave, right?
Well, and don't run. I mean, it didn't happen really, but it was like, don't try to get closer to the person that you're upset with. I mean, like, what are you doing? It's funny because I was like, well, you could do what Megan did, which is like, find one of your friends. And it was like, oh, was there no one to go to? Like, I
No,
mean,
I
I'm
don't.
sure
Well,
my mom was
and
busy.
yeah, I mean, I think that that's the problem is the narcissist stories that they tell do start to unravel when you get too many details. So even if she'd gone up to someone and said, Megan is here, she's a horrible person, she's done horrible things to me, I'm incredibly uncomfortable, the story would have sort of started to unravel because it's like, well, what did she do to you? Well, she's not talking to me. Okay. Like, well, why didn't you not talk to her then? Like,
Right. Yes.
like,
Yes.
like
Yes.
she wouldn't, I don't think if she'd even gone to someone, she would have been able to, like, the holes in the story would have quickly, like,
Yeah.
started poking
Yeah, that's
through,
true.
right?
Yeah, that's true.
Anyway, all
Okay.
right, tools. What is a tool you've used this week that has helped you?
I took a shower this morning and it was invigorating. Sometimes it's, because I'm not necessarily working, I don't have to like be professionally groomed every day. And not that I didn't take a shower yesterday, I took a shower yesterday, but it was just, I just felt alive again. And I was like, I can go out into the world. I felt great. Sometimes it's that simple.
Sometimes it is that simple.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is that simple. I found another piece of the puzzle of like health stuff, and I've made a change in how I eat that has started to make a difference. And for me, I think that it's like this healing shit is hard, and other people don't always have the answers. Sometimes you have to figure it out on your own when other people should have been able to figure it out for you. Like there are professionals for that shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the fact that I am continuing to try to move forward and make it better, like I had this moment of like, oh, like this is what self-care is.
Oh, yeah.
You know, like
Yeah.
self-care is slowly and gently and kindly trying to figure out like which string do you pull next to try and undo this giant knot. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's been created.
Yeah.
And like I had this moment of actually appreciating myself, which is the child of a narcissist is hard, of like, oh, I'm still doing this, but I'm not doing it in a way anymore that feels like I'm trying to bash it with a mallet. I'm doing it in a way that feels like I'm sort of trying to gently and lovingly try new things and see how they sit,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's
Yeah.
less of the like, what's wrong with me that I'm not healed, right? Like I feel like
Yeah.
I realize that I'm getting to the point where that's not how I'm talking to myself as much anymore,
Mhm.
which felt really good.
That's really great. I hear comfort, right? That slow and attentive. Yeah, it's comfort. And it's not a crisis, right? Like I think that because we were on the roller coaster all our lives, we would just go from crisis to crisis to crisis. And so for me anyway, the little things wouldn't get done, right? So like, for a year I'd have like my broken shoelace on my tennis shoes because I never bothered to actually just go and get new shoelaces, right?
Yeah.
I was just too busy. And, this kind of thing is these little things, even just taking the time to do a little thing. Yeah, it flies in the face of the history.
It does. And I think that, one of the things for me that I've had to learn is I developed a like, especially as the golden child, I developed a really nasty case of perfectionism,
Yeah.
right? Because I was put on this pedestal that was so high that if I fell off, it was going to be deadly. And it was also the size of like, a needle, right? Like it was just this
Yeah.
tiny little, very, very high, very thin thing. And so this fear of not doing it perfectly and completely the first time was really, really real. And I think when I started healing, and when I say healing, I mean like mind body healing. So emotional healing, physical healing, adrenal fatigue, all the shit that happens when you grow up in households like this.
Yeah.
I still was carrying with me the perfectionism energy in
Sure.
trying to heal the damage.
Right.
And it's taken me a really, really long time to try to heal, like you said, gently and with care. You've actually been a model for me for that because I think you were much better at that way earlier than I was, right? Of just like, oh, right, I don't have to find the solution to whatever this problem is and implement it as rigorously as is humanly possible so that I heal in the shortest amount of time,
Right. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't have to approach it with that energy. I can be kind with it. I can be gentle. I can, you know, be human, right? I mean, a lot of that is I'm not an object, I'm a human, right? So
Yeah.
you want an object to work as efficiently and quickly as possible, but that's
Yes.
not what you want out of a human,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Except capitalism. Sorry.
well, again, that is a narcissistic system. We absolutely
Yeah.
should do an episode or write a guide about like the narcissistic child abuse survivor's guide to late stage capitalism, like and autocracy.
Yeah, it's an ongoing battle. As you're talking, I'm thinking about Becky Chambers, and maybe we can find a way to talk about her and her work in a
Yes. In my dream world, we have her on the podcast.
yeah. In my dream world, I'm actually living in her books. But yes,
Oh, that too.
but yes, but we have a podcast in her world and she comes on.
But we wouldn't have a topic to talk about. We'd be like, everything's great.
It would be a picnic. It would be an interview show where we basically just have a picnic with someone and we just hang out and have a good time.
We'd be tea monks. We'd be tea monks
Yeah.
with a podcast.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening. We hope that this little foray into movies was slightly less traumatic. I don't know that it was.
I don't think I
A
dissociated
sign
as
of
much as I
entertainment
usually do.
with your trauma.
I don't think I dissociated as much as
Oh,
I
good.
usually do.
Good. That's a good sign. That's a good sign. I think me too. Yeah, I don't feel
Or
quite
one.
yeah, I don't feel quite so completely and utterly drained as I usually do. So that's good. It's a good sign.
Okay.
It's a good sign.
Aw.
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, we would just invite all of you listeners, if you've been told that you are a monster and that you are a blood-sucking emotional vampire by your family, just embrace it. Yes, I am, and I don't give two shits about you. How does it feel? And yeah, just go with it. Be the villain. Thank you for listening. We'd be so grateful if you'd follow or subscribe and rate and review our new podcast on your favorite podcast app.
Make sure to share it with friends, family, or anyone that you think may benefit from this content.
And as a final reminder, you are not the crazy one.